murder the princes, and there's this great tenderness and sadness with which he sort of carries out the deed, and one can't help but feel sympathy for him. Karloff brought himself to those parts. I wouldn't think necessarily the director had said, oh, I want you to show tenderness here, but he would have, as an actor, would have wanted to do that.
There's a physical eagerness in his body language. He leans into people, he leans over people, and there's a glint in the eye which is attractive, but it's the glint of something predatory.
In the early 40s, very enterprising producers talked Boris Karloff into appearing in their comedy on Broadway, Arsenic and Old Lace. And the part was specifically written for Boris Karloff.
He didn't want to do it. He felt he was unworthy to be an actor on Broadway, which is remarkable to think about. Arsenic and Old Lace showed that he was a terrific actor, and that he also was a good sport, certainly, to take that joking in it. So it made him very, very wealthy. Arsenic and Old Lace was one of the most successful plays in the history of the American theater, and Karloff stayed in it for 3 years.
I was doing interviews of actors for British film fan magazines, and I was able to get an interview with Karloff. We hit it off quite well together, because I suppose partly also because of my English background. And one day he handed me a story, which at the time was called Stranglehold, which had been written for him specifically. He had agreed to do the film for me, and we changed the title to The Haunted Strangler, or in England it was called Grip of the Strangler, and we made the film, and it was so successful that Karloff agreed to do another film with me, which was called Corridors of Blood.
Karloff seems, for a major star, to have been singularly without ego, and very much saw himself, I think all the way through his life, as a kind of jobbing actor who got a lucky break. Universal Films and others, they were a good gig while they lasted, but that's an actor's life.
After Arsenic and Old Lace, Boris Karloff came back to Hollywood. He signed a 2-picture contract with Universal. He did The Climax, in which he played a hypnotist, and he did The Rowdy House of Frankenstein, in which he resurrected all of the big Universal monsters, Lon Chaney's Wolfman, John Carradine's Dracula, Glenn Strange's Frankenstein monster.
All the protection of a traveling show. I as Lampini, you as my assistant. Free to move on towards those for whom I have unloving memories.
I think Karloff came back to the horror film after Arsenic and Old Lace because it was what the audiences wanted to see him do. And he always said that you were a very lucky actor if audiences showed a preference for what they wanted to see you do.
15,000 marks. 1,000 for every year that I spent in a stinking, slimy dungeon. You bargained poorly, Herr Ullman.
Don't kill me. Don't kill me. Don't.
Kill my trusted old assistant? Why, no. I'm going to repay you for betraying me.
He often made very wise career choices within the genre, finding himself in the 40s working for Val Lewton in a style completely different than the horror films he'd made for Universal was a brilliant move.
The Body Snatcher, which many people believe is his greatest performance, his masterpiece performance, and a performance that really, I think, was fully deserving of an Academy Award. In fact, he said that Val Lewton was the man who rescued him from the living dead and restored his soul. He had that much respect for Lewton.
They're horror roles, but there's a whole wealth of feeling and breadth in them.
One of the truly mesmerizing villains in Hollywood history in that film.
One thing we rather underrate Karloff for was his business savvy. Not just in the types of film roles he took, but in recognizing that movies weren't the only thing. He always kept a really solid presence in radio because he had that great voice. He could do a wide range of things. He did like children's stuff on the radio as well as scary stuff. And in the 50s, when horror films disappear, he has a couple of years where he just goes and makes television programs.
He used his career very wisely. He knew what he was doing. He got into television very early, which I think was a very clever move. His first TV series in the 1940s, when television was still in its infancy. And he wasn't one of those actors who said, I'm going to stay away from television, it's going to destroy the movies. He said, let me embrace this medium and see what I can do. And because of that, we got series like The Veil and especially Thriller, which are, you know, incredibly good horror TV series. And I'm delighted that Karloff put his stamp on those shows. And he wasn't afraid of working in television, or radio for that matter. He embraced the new technology and he used it to the best of its advantage. And so again, a whole new generation grew up in the 1950s and 60s knowing him only as a television star.
When you look at the resumes of these guys, I mean, they did a lot of stuff in their lives. I mean, more stuff than a lot of people can do now, because there were just the media outlets were different then. But Karloff always had the better material, I think, and he could jump from picture like The Strange Door, or, you know, some potboiler kind of a movie, and then, you know, in the same decade do, you know, The Secret Life of Walter Mitty.
So television, being then much more like the stage, because it was live and the three-camera system, gave Karloff a great deal of freedom and scope, which I think allowed him then to go back into the horror realm with his pride intact, if you like. He wasn't simply being typecast in horror pictures.
Karloff's impact on the horror genre is impacted by the fact that he became a sort of a folk hero in the 60s to kids. Because of their interest in Frankenstein, and the fact that he was able to parlay that into a very visible hosting job on Thriller, which was an extremely popular show with kids.
Of course, he worked very well on that show, both as the host and also as the guest star in several episodes. Karloff really became one of the most versatile character actors in the world, and a character actor who was able to jump from one medium to the other with incredible ease.
Yeah, he saw that in order to, as it were, stay current with the audience, he needed to keep up with it. He had a sense that he could always rely on an audience's affection to get him work.
Karloff got mileage that I don't think any other horror actor ever was able to achieve. He worked with everybody who was notable in the genre. He did those wonderfully high-spirited comedies with Roger Corman. He did The Raven in The Comedy of Terrors. He was able to work with Mario Bava in Black Sabbath. He was able to even go on a show like Shindig and sing the Peppermint Twist while go-go girls danced around him in ghoulish outfits. I mean, he did it all.
To me, he is the voice of Dr. Seuss, isn't it? I mean, Jim Carrey didn't come close.
He virtually kind of, if not entirely summing up 50 years of the horror movie, he's certainly central to an enormous amount of it.
Boris Karloff was allowed a very graceful swan song in the horror genre in Peter Bogdanovich's Targets. Again, a role that was designed for him, written for him, and a movie that would not have been made without him. It was, first and foremost, a Boris Karloff movie.
He plays an elderly horror actor who reminisces about working in the criminal code for Howard Hawks and tells stories beautifully, as if he's everyone's great-granddad, telling stories of the oral tradition of Hollywood of old. And this wonderful moment at the end where the serial killer is standing there, and there's the terror on the screen, and there's Karloff, this old man who actually has difficulty walking by that stage. He was very bow-legged, stumbles towards him, and the serial can't work out on the screen or the real actor. And in that confusion, they capture him.
It made a statement about both the horror genre and the horror of modern life by juxtaposing them.
I think there are moments in Targets where you see something that's very close to the real Boris Karloff, although I also think that he devoted quite a lot of time to concealing the real Boris Karloff.
It's possibly the single greatest tribute to an actor who appears within that very film.
It's not actually his last film, but let's pretend it is. You know, I mean, let's pretend he didn't go and make those quickies in Mexico afterwards. Yeah, because it is a farewell performance.
Boris Karloff, because he maneuvered around in the genre so much, was the one star who ended up working with most of the other horror stars in every period.
I'm not afraid of you. I needed more evidence for the police. I got it tonight when I followed you here from the dressing room, in time to save this child. You killed Marcelina.
You'll never say that again.
There's a through line of Boris Karloffness from my very first performance to my very last. This particular piece of celluloid nonsense I'm in right now doesn't matter as much as my truth and allegiance to the Karloffness of Karloff.
I'd like you to have my notes and records. Of all the newspapers, yours was the only one which was fair to me.
I think one of the great strengths of Karloff as an actor is he was able to bring much more, even to the smallest roles he played, or the most underwritten roles he played. He could always bring something to them to make them a little bit different and a little bit more interesting and keep you watching.
He was, a broad, solid, decent character player who could more or less do what he wanted. I think he was best in his horror roles. The macabre does seem to have brought out absolutely his finest work.
You can't knock Frankenstein. I mean, it is quite an amazing performance. I mean, it's something that could have been a stunt, and instead it turned out to be something indelible. You gotta hand it to him.
I'm convinced that Karloff is, in fact, one of the most able actors in the history of cinema. He's often overlooked as such because of his association so strongly with, particularly with one part, but with one genre, with horror.
He's left us a legacy of great performances in the horror genre. Probably a legacy that will not be matched by anyone.
He said with great sincerity that if he ever gave up acting, he'd be dead in a few months. He couldn't live without it. It was really his passion.
He starts out as William Henry Pratt, and that over his career he invents this Boris Karloff, who is this strange image of the genteel but slightly sinister Englishman. Like many great stars, his greatest performance is himself.